next presenter is a very unusual fellow from Chicago, Mr. David Hershey. David works in the pension area, and he's an innovator there, and his concepts and activities have been changing the nature of the pension world. And his subject is Arthur Kitson, a fellow who was a fascinating guy, as you'll see. And without any further introduction, Mr. David Hershey.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to be here again and to see all your familiar faces and friendly faces. One of our attendees here I just met, Norman, I don't know how to say your last name, but he just drove down from Minneapolis. And the unusual thing is that we're both involved in the same kind of pension strategies and interested in monetary reform. And Norman will be speaking tomorrow about GESL and the 100% reserve system. So we feel like we're really brothers here that bonded with the same interests. We're both kind of unusual interests. To find each other here is wonderful, but another one of the great services provided by AMI. So who was this remarkable man, Arthur Kitson? I will do my best to give a brief answer to that today. Let me preface my remarks by saying that I believe the best way to study history is through biography, and we best make the story of our past come alive by studying the lives of the great men and women of that era. This was certainly the method that Stephen adopted in The Lost Science of Money. Stephen's great achievement was to take a notoriously dry and abstract inquiry into the history of money and make it come alive through the study of these great men who championed a just monetary system. Now, I have 3 boys at home, ages 7, 9, and 10, and my wife and I just transferred them to a new school this fall. It's part of a growing number of classical Christian schools. One of the many things that sold me on this school was their approach to history. Their method teaches history through biography, and by putting on display the heroes they can emulate, they use history and literature as a means of developing a child's moral imagination. So they do a number of things right, such as they teach European history rather than social studies, classical literature and poetry, Latin beginning in the 3rd grade, Greek in the 6th grade, and they just do a tremendous job of returning the students to our roots in Western civilization. So if any of you are familiar with John Ruskin's work, you know that part of the power of his writing comes from his deep understanding of the Greek and Latin words, the roots of those words in English that he employs. So my dream is to raise the next generation of monetary reformers with a keen awareness of their heritage in the Greek, Roman, and Christian thought. I think it's a type of school that you will hear more about, and for those of you with grammar-aged children or grandchildren, I would highly recommend it. I love this focus on developing a moral imagination. I think most of us in this room believe that we cannot divorce the economic from the ethical. And Kitson often repeated, for an action to be economically good, it must also be ethically good. Arthur Kitson's last work was named Pilgrim's Progress, written by a fellow pilgrim. I have reasons to believe this work is semi-autobiographical. He begins the introduction in this manner. Those blessed with a lively imagination can imagine how famous literary heroes might respond to our contemporary society. Who among you can imagine how a Don Quixote or a Hamlet might act today? And in this 462-page work, Kitson takes it upon himself to reenact how Paul Bunyan might have written Pilgrim's Progress were he alive at that time. Kitson felt that just as religious intolerance was the biggest threat to freedom in Bunyan's time, intolerance in the field of economics was becoming bitter and oppressive. Bunyan fought for religious freedom, for the right to proclaim religious truths that he understood and believed them. Today we fight for economic freedom and the right to live, to publish, and to teach economic truths. Before I start on the particulars of Kitson's life, can we have a show of hands in the room of how many of you were familiar with the name or read the works of Arthur Kitson before attending this conference? Okay. About a handful of 5 or 6, I think. For those of you who know him, rate him on a scale of 1 to 10 for his contribution to the work of monetary reform. 10 being a Delmar Alexander, William Jennings Bryan, or Frederick Soddy, or pick whom you might from the pantheon Steve presented in The Lost Science of Money. And a 0 being one of those various misinformed or malevolent commodity men, such as Robert Peel, Walter Bagot, or Frederick Hayek. Now, where would you rank Arthur Kitson on the extent to which his life helped lift us to that mountain peak for which we're all striving, the pinnacle of a fair and true monetary system? Anybody care to shout out their ranking? No? My hunch is that coming in here that Arthur Kitson was underrated. And I don't think his work has received the attention and appreciation it deserves. So my purpose here is to lift his stars in your eyes, and at the very least, I think at the end we'll agree that he deserves an A for effort. In the 1890s, Kitson cut his teeth in monetary reform by joining in with William Jennings Bryan in the 1896 campaign for president. Monetary reform was a cause for which Kitson would devote over 40 years of his life. He saw himself in a fight to the death with the money power, a noun which often appears capitalized in his works, just as it did in the works of Martin Van Buren, as Steve pointed out in his book. Kitson's first major work, A Scientific Solution of the Money Question, was published in 1894. He identified the money power as a group seeking world domination for itself without regards to the good of mankind, and its instrument for domination was the gold standard. The book brought its author widespread recognition as it was reviewed in hundreds of newspapers and magazines throughout America. At the time, Kitson was beginning a highly successful career as an engineer, an inventor, an entrepreneur. The Kitson light was used in lighthouses throughout the world. His company, Kitson Lighting, had offices in 35 countries throughout the world and employed at its height over 50,000 workers. The book Web of Finance contains the following description of Kitson's career. Arthur Kitson was an engineer, a Whitworth Scholar, managing director of Kitson Engineering, a patentee of over 500 inventions, the father of modern banking reform, and the most active and effective critic of the financial systems of England and America. As a side note, he quit his first job in business to return to his first love, classical music. In 1884, he organized the May Musical Festival for the state of Iowa. He personally financed this highly successful 3-day festival. He trained 500 voices to sing in the choir and personally played the organ during the concerts. He did return to his engineering career shortly thereafter, but continued his hobby over the course of his life by playing musical instruments, singing in choirs, and listening to the classical composers he loved, such as Beethoven, Chopin, Haydn, and Mendelssohn. But back to his work on monetary reform. The popularity of Kitson's first book during the 1890s can be traced to the intense debate that was taking place in America between the gold standard and the bimetallic standard that included silver. Kitson compared the two systems and concluded that the bimetallism was saner than monometallism because it furnished a broader base and a more generous supply of money. But Kitson and Bryan agreed that the state issued and controlled paper money, like the greenback the U.S. enjoyed during the Civil War, was superior to commodity money. He wrote well before Keynes that monetary metallism is barbaric and ought to be relegated to the scrap heap of history. The publication of The Scientific Solution brought Kitson into a personal relationship with William Jennings Bryan, whose famous Cross of Gold speech launched him on the Democratic candidate for president in 1896. Following Bryan's death, Kitson contributed an article to the Fortnightly Review magazine in which he told of his conversations with Bryan that led to Kitson campaigning in the state of Pennsylvania on Bryan's behalf. A reviewer of Kitson's book wrote in the Philadelphia Reviewer on March 29, 1895, "Just now, the business community is deeply perturbed over the struggle between monometallism and bimetallism. But that struggle would sink into nothingness the moment we all realize the insight contained in Mr. Kitson's idea of a paper currency that is based solely on public confidence and redeemable in the general wealth of the community." Just to show you one example of the unflagging energy Kitson devoted to monetary reform, while campaigning on Bryan's behalf, the papers at the time reported on a debate sponsored by the New Century Club in Philadelphia between Kitson and the Postmaster General in Pennsylvania. The debate began at 11 a.m. and did not end until after 5 p.m. Kitson was at the center of the Bryan campaign, or his book was at the center of the Bryan campaign. A scientific solution was actively debated in both houses of Congress, and in a typical example of the backhanded tactics used by the money powers, the two American professors who used a scientific solution as a textbook in their economics classes, but the alumni supporters of these two colleges managed to have the book banned and the professors expelled. Here are some quotes from Scientific Solution that put it at the center of the debate. Money is a social instrument and morally belongs to the people. Money is merely a title to wealth. Money is redeemed every time it is accepted by the public for goods and services and needs no gold redemption. It's important to realize both Kitson and Bryan did not believe in commodity money. Stephen commented on this in The Lost Science of Money. William Jennings Bryan knew that government-issued greenbacks were superior to a bimetallic standard, but he also knew that the public opinion had not yet caught up with the idea of a non-convertible paper money. They adopted bimetallism as a more broadly acceptable plan, which they could use to unseat the money power. Kitson's historical reputation casts him mainly as an opponent of the gold standard. That he was, but he was also more than that. In addition, he developed a high concept of money that could replace the gold standard with a state-issued money targeted to a price index. He recommended we use this new standard to overcome the stranglehold the money power held over finance and prevent the plutocracy in its rise to power in World War I England. Now, you have that list of Kitson publications in front of you. His career tracks the outline of his published look, so if you want to refer to that as I go through the rest of his career back in England. Following Bryan's defeat to William McKinley, Kitson returned to London and began giving talks on monetary reform. The substance of these talks were gathered and published in 1903 under the title Money Question. He started an organization called the League for Monetary and Banking Reform, and he began publishing a monthly journal devoted to currency reform titled The Open Review. Mr. Kiston edited, financed, and published the journal. The League meetings were held throughout the United Kingdom, and as a result of Kitson's influence, several of the members published their own books on the money question. In 1911, Kitson wrote an open letter to Chancellor Mr. Lloyd George, warning him of the dangers of the gold standard and prophesying its collapse in the event of a great war. Here's a quote from that letter. "The gold standard means inevitable war. Nations cannot possibly exist for long under it. The children born of it are fire and sword, red ruin, and the breaking up of laws. The repudiation of debt will become inevitable. Nations must strangle this monster, or it'll strangle them. The gold debts of the world cannot be redeemed in gold. The question of our monetary system is the greatest moral, the greatest social question mankind has ever had to consider. All other questions sink into insignificance compared to this one. Our answer will determine the character of the drama we will shortly have to witness, and upon which the curtain of the 20th century is about to rise." Now, looking backward from the 21st century, I doubt whether any one of us in this room would challenge the veracity of Kitson's comments. Events have justified his dramatic rhetoric. Judged by its effects on the social and business affairs of Great Britain, the Conf Currency Commission report, issued in August 1918, is the most important document of the post-World War I period. This document advised the adoption of certain monetary policies which were accepted by the coalition government of Lloyd George in 1920 and led to the ruinous deflationary policy in the years immediately following its adoption. Winston Churchill intensified these evils by establishing the gold standard in 1925. In accordance with the recommendations of the Conf Committee, The Great Depression of the 1930s can be traced directly to the deflationary policies pursued by the central banks in the large industrial countries after the war. Great Britain is responsible for the adoption of these deflationary policies, and the men responsible for urging Great Britain to pursue this policy were the members of the Conf Currency Committee. In 1918, Kitson said the war debt was incurred in cheap pounds, and honest dealing requires repayment in pounds and in commodities of the same value as when the debt was incurred. If, however, the value is raised, as it was following the Napoleonic Wars and the American Civil War, by returning to gold, it will mean the complete enslavement of the people to a soulless monetary despotism for ages, or compulsory repudiation of the debt. Kitson published The Banker's Conspiracy in 1933 as a protest against those statesmen and bankers who often asserted no one could possibly have foretold the present crisis. The truth is, Arthur Kitson did foretell of the crisis that led to the Great Depression, and he directed his criticism in a timely manner to those men responsible for the policies that led to the credit contraction and depression. Arthur Kitson was one of the few businessmen outside of the banking profession invited to give evidence before the Conf Currency Committee. Kitson sent to each member of the committee in January 1919 a written criticism of the Conf Currency Commission report. The contents of his criticism are contained in the book Banker's Conspiracy. The final report of this committee was issued in December of that same year. No attempt was ever made to answer Kitson's criticism, even though Kitson deliberately challenged the truth of many of the assertions and impugned the theories upon which the policies they recommended were based. Kitson spoke out to warn the public of the crime contemplated by London's leading bankers. The bankers' theft was to be accomplished by raising the value of the pound sterling to its pre-war exchange rate and thereby increasing the burden of all the war debts and the value of all the war bonds. It was by reading the fraudulent standard in 1917 that Nobel Prize-winning Oxford scientist Frederick Soddy became interested in monetary reform. From there, he began writing and speaking out on monetary issues. And as I noted at last year's AMI conference, his public comments on monetary reform led to the ruin of his career as a scientist. Soddy's principal work, Wealth, Virtual Wealth, and Debt, paid tribute to Arthur Kitson with this inspired inscription: dedicated to Arthur Kitson, the British pioneer of the new economics, whose writings the author owes his initial interest in the fascinating problems of wealth and currency. Excuse me just a second. In 1922, U.S. inventor Thomas Edison sent a questionnaire to Kitson. As an industrious and thorough scientist, Edison was surveying the opinions to the best-known economist of his day regarding the plan he had to reform the U.S. financial system. Arthur Kitson was the only economist Edison surveyed that agreed with his plan, which broadly called for replacing the gold standard with the greenback system and paying for public works projects with non-interest-bearing currency. Isn't it fascinating that in the early 1920s, three major inventors, Thomas Edison, Arthur Kitson, and Frederick Soddy, turned their attention away from their science and towards our banking system and came up with the monetary reform initiatives based essentially on the same principles advocated by our group here, the AMI. New economics. For an overview of precisely what Kitson meant when he referred to new economics, you can turn to the second page of the handout I just distributed. Kitson noted that he had read literally hundreds of books on economics. You can be sure that he read every major work on economics since the time of Adam Smith. From my study of his writings, he was well versed in the works of Smith, Ricardo, Mill, and Marx. The list of books given here amounted to a sustained effort to overturn the classical school and construct in its place what Kitson referred to as the new economics. The new economics essentially left in place the freedom of everyone to pursue their own vocation, to freely bargain and to compete, It secured for each person the full right to the fruits of their labor. The work they did was to dig deeper than Marx on the issue of the surplus value created by labor. If you read the works of Ruskin, Proudhon, George, and Gessel, you will see these men gave their lives to discovering whether there was justice in the distribution of rent, interest, and profits. And what they discovered was injustice in ground rents and money interest that they referred to as usury. Unfortunately, outside of a handful of citizens, some of whom we are blessed to share this room with, the men and women of the 20th century did not follow through on the findings of the new economics. The 1931 November edition of National Review said, under the title Giving Honor Where Honor is Due, for over 40 years, Mr. Kitson has been carrying on, at his own expense, educational endeavors to expose the superstition and ignorance of those who champion this ruinous gold standard policy. Mr. Kitson has not only given of his time and energies freely on behalf of the citizens of this nation, but has spent over 20,000 pounds of his own money in publishing literature and distributing it throughout the country. Converted into today's money, Kitson spent the equivalent of $3.5 million on the cause of monetary reform, or roughly $90,000 per year of his own money over the course of 40 years. Over this 40-year period, Kitson was connected with practically every association having for its object the elimination of gold and of privately issued money backed by gold, and advocating its replacement with publicly issued paper money backed by the communities credited. Mr. Kitson was asked if he had ever calculated the number of speeches, lectures, and talks on money reform that he had delivered to a public audience. When his friends suggested perhaps an average of one per week over the past 40 years, Mr. Kitson replied that 2,000 public talks would likely prove an underestimate. Now, last year, one of the students in the audience asked me how I could continue to work in the investment field when I was aware of the kind of injustices embedded in our financial system. That's the advantage of having college students in the audience. You can always count on them to ask the impertinent questions. But the student actually did me a favor with his question, in that my conscience would not let it go. Unfortunately, the audience for books on monetary reform is not large enough for even the best of writers to eke out a living, as I am sure Stephen and other members in this group will attest. That in itself is not an adequate response, but what I found helpful as I sorted this out was a special editorial written by the Times Supplement in 1918. They wrote, Mr. Kitson was able to expose most effectively the complete bankruptcy of orthodox economists. Mr. Kitson writes vigorously, when he attacks our modern banking system, not only in our modern administrative methods, but in the principles upon which this whole system is founded, Mr. Kitson's business reputation and record are known to the world. It would be absurd to pretend to ignore a successful businessman who finds other businessmen eager to attend his lectures and hear his views on these problems to which he has devoted so much of his study. Now, I am no Arthur Kitson, but I will say that I am able to do the best I can for this cause by working within the industry. It puts me in a position to be better informed, to talk with folks in the industry, to develop a recognizable name, and to speak from a position of authority on financial matters. Many of us here have probably experienced the sting that comes from being relegated to the status of a monetary crank. I have opportunities on a regular basis to bring up monetary reform in the course of casual conversations with my coworkers. Occasionally it doesn't go so well. One time I shared with a colleague an article I had received unsolicited from someone living in the UK. It was a well thought out 20-page report on pension reform. Not great, but it was good. But rather than take this fellow's work seriously, my colleague says, "Oh, this must have been written by one of those guys working in his shorts on the basement PC with stray Cheetos hanging from his beard." And then everyone gets a good laugh and is relieved of the duty of wrestling with some of the concepts that might upset their way of life to which they've grown accustomed. Is this a story anyone in the room here can relate to? Kitson did not fully endorse the program promoted by Major Douglas known as social credit. Their differences went so far that at one point Kitson and Soddy broke away from a group Kitson had formed because he felt it was leaning too heavily towards Douglas. So Kitson and Soddy simply started a new group. I recall this episode because Kitson's interaction with Douglas revealed a side of his character that is fairly unique among highly talented and successful individuals. Kitson was always willing to accord a place of honor and recognition to every other writer and worker in the field of monetary reform, so long as he believed them to be honestly desirous of aiding humanity. Kitson's writing reflects a generosity of spirit generally absent in Soddy. Soddy sometimes lapses into a strident tone. His biographers report that his final days were marked by bitterness. When Major Douglas's first book was published in 1920, Kitson gave recognition to Douglas's proposals in articles he contributed to the New Age magazine. This gracious gesture called forth a letter by Major Douglas. Now, to fully appreciate the weight of these words, you need to know that Major Douglas was a taciturn man, an engineer by training, one not given to compromise. I can see by the faces in the room some nods and acknowledgments. You know the type. My father was a civil engineer, a few words, so I know the type only too well. So Major Douglas is not one given to gratuitous sentiments, but he wrote a letter to Kitson that said, "The articles you wrote forwarding my social credit proposals above your own have served to restore my faith in human nature." Kitson's reform package. I think by now we can all admire Kitson's efforts towards monetary reform. Kitson developed a high concept of money that also deserves our admiration. The key elements of Soddy's reform proposals, with one exception, were contained in Kitson's mature work. Kitson laid the groundwork, Soddy put on the finishing touches on the edifice and crowned it with the key element of banking reform, requiring banks to maintain 100% currency reserves. Here's a quote representative of Kitson's mature thought regarding money. "The wealth of a nation is due and proportional to the productive energies of its inhabitants. Money, currency, and banking expedients are not wealth, but merely claims to wealth. Nor is money in any sense productive, but rather it is merely a convenient means of exchanging and distributing wealth. Hence, the virtue of any banking and currency system should be judged according to its ability to facilitate production and trade." Now, what are the defining elements of Kitson's monetary reform agenda? I believe you will find the necessary elements in it near and dear to our hearts. 1, money is defined by law and is not a tradable commodity. 2, money is issued by the state for the public's benefit, not issued by banks for private benefit. 3, money to retain its role as an expression or measure of value must be limited in quantity. And 4, the government can precisely calibrate the quantity of money to match the quantity of goods and services offered in the market. By matching changes in the supply of money to changes in the supply of goods and services, money serves as an invariable standard of measurement. Today, this technique of maintaining an invariable standard of money is known as inflation index targeting. It has become widely accepted by many orthodox economists, including Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke. Great Britain, during the war years of 1915 to 1916, discovered the true principles of state-issued paper money and benefited tremendously for it. Here was a system for employing the national credit for productive purposes which belonged to the public and could be used by the government without any cost for interest charges, and yet the government allowed this safest and finest currency system the world has ever known to be destroyed for the benefit of the London bankers. They enabled the Bank of England, a privately owned trading company, to issue its own promissory notes without any obligation of the bank to redeem them. Here, quoted from The Banker's Conspiracy, is Kitson's eloquent summary of a true money system as it existed in Great Britain during World War I, before it reverted back to the gold standard. A state-issued paper money, non-interest bearing, issued automatically, retired automatically, self-regulating for the purpose of maintaining an invariable measure of value, never redundant, never deficient, neutral in its effect on prices, but rising equal to any strain on it, guaranteed against debasement by the state that issues it, incapable of debasement by the community that purchases and uses it. The control of the amount in circulation lay entirely in the hands of the community and was determined by the community's need for currency and ability to pay for it. Neither the state nor the bankers had any control over the amount in circulation. It increased in amount when required by the expansion of business activity, and it decreased in amount with their contraction. It bore all the strain of wartime by its automatic expansion, and then in the slump it automatically contracted. It has no relation to any gold cover, is not convertible into gold, and is no way affected by the fortunes of gold. The money, therefore, was not a source of inflation or deflation. Its own movements were the consequences and the effect, not the cause of price movements. Now, for my findings, Kitson was right about money, but Soddy extended his thoughts to banking. Soddy improved on Kitson's approach to monetary reform in two fundamental ways. The first was merely a refinement and clarification, and the second represented an important innovation. First, Soddy refined and more clearly defined Kitson's notion of an inflation index target. Kitson held that money should represent what he called an invariable standard, and he said that the quantity of money should be adjusted to keep prices stable. But Soddy defined exactly the basket of goods the authorities should target. He explained the mechanism of creating a separate independent government agency, analogous to a Bureau of Weights and Measures, charged with adjusting the quantity of money to maintain a constant price index. Second, Soddy's key innovation was his notion to require 100% currency backing for bank deposits. Kitson's bank reform measures fell far short of the elegance of Soddy's proposal. Kitson understood the need to control the ability of banks to create deposits and to recapture the seigniorage banks made through private money creation, but his methods were inadequate. To control deposit growth, Kitson required banks to collateralize new loans with assets. To recapture seigniorage, Kitson proposed to nationalize the banks. In my opinion, requiring 100% currency reserves is a far more efficient and effective means to accomplish Kitson's purposes. A couple of months ago, I came across a small book written by Frederick Hayek called Monetary Nationalism. In it, Hayek discusses the merits of 100% currency reserve banking. But he ultimately dismissed it because of the ease with which money market mutual funds could be set up to compete with the banks. True to his Austrian roots, Hayek feared excessive regulations would be required to prevent money market mutual funds from outcompeting banks for deposits. Clearly, an unregulated money fund could pay a higher interest rate than banks required to maintain 100% currency reserves. The trouble with Hayek's position is that we cannot leave money market mutual funds unregulated because they could never survive a crisis in confidence. We just experienced a dose of this in August. Depositors fled any mutual fund not 100% invested in government securities. All commercial-backed and asset-backed money market funds were experiencing bank runs. Without the availability of the various tools of the Federal Reserve, like the discount window borrowing and open market operations, none of the money funds can meet the demands for instant liquidity without breaking the buck, meaning keeping their net asset value at par. A money market fund can't pay interest without a mismatch risk. It can't have a mismatch risk without market risk, and it can't have market risk without the threat of a financial panic that spills over into the real economy. Unless you require 100% currency reserves behind demand deposits, you are going to require regulatory oversight and a bailout mechanism to avoid a crisis. So Hayek's argument is disingenuous. He argues against 100% reserves because it would require excessive regulation to block mutual funds from entering the business, but in an unregulated environment, money funds' mismatch risk must be bailed out to avoid a crisis. And lastly, about a month ago, it was near the end of August, I was reading the Sunday edition of the Chicago Tribune, and I opened up to an editorial written by Stephen Chapman, whom some of you Chicagoans may know. He was writing about the seizing up in the financial markets sparked by the fears of widespread mortgage delinquencies. And he opened with the following paragraph. This episode brings to mind a quote from John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, in which the lead character, Tom Joad, lamented, "The bank is something more than men, I tell you. It's a monster. Men made it, but they can't control it." So wow, I'm thinking Steinbeck really gets it. An interesting piece on money in the Chicago Tribune? This is my lucky day. But alas, in spite of reading Steinbeck, Chapman himself didn't get it. Chapman goes on to say that the ghost of Tom Joad inhabits the body of many commentators today who want to blame today's crisis of confidence on the Wall Street bankers. True to his libertarian leanings, Chapman then used the rest of the article to defend the U.S. financial system. But Steinbeck was on Kitson's side. He used this scene in The Grapes of Wrath to blame the bankers for the Great Depression. Kitson also blamed the bankers for the Great Depression, but he went deeper to uncover and expose the deflationary policies and their nefarious activities to the light of day. He had a name for the monster Steinbeck referred to. He called it the money power. And I'll end by quoting the dedication from Kitson's last book, Pilgrim's Progress by a Fellow Pilgrim. Kitson dedicated the book to an anonymous friend he referred to as Hardy Fighter, an allegorical name used in Bunyan's original. Here's the quote. "To my friend and fellow fighter, Hardy Fighter, in the campaign for righteousness against the money power, the chief cause of the world's economic evils and miseries." Unquote. Thank you.